Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil, episode 145, The Gods of Gardul. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome back. As always, my name is Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And I'm your special co-host this weekend, Kristin Ingram.
Yes, it's not Michael. Michael is, of course, in the plains of Kaput. He's investigating an orc raiding party, I believe. It's very exciting for Michael. So everyone's in Michael his best so he can possibly get past the orcs.
Okay, then.
Okay. And just as a little bit of news here, I'd like to announce that I finally have uploaded episodes to YouTube. So if it's a place you'd like to go check it out, feel free to do so. I'm not sure what's going on. I can't seem to comment on anything that's commented, but if YouTube's a place that you like to listen to occasionally, especially when you're working on your computer, feel free. Or iHeartRadio. I just realized they never emailed me to let me know, but we've been on iHeartRadio, I think, for 4 or 5 episodes now. And so I'm very excited about that. So if you can keep up the subscriptions, we appreciate it. If you have a service like T-Mobile where your streaming is free and you're out and about, YouTube and iHeartRadio are 2 great ways to listen, and it doesn't count towards your data.
Woohoo!
Yes,
that's very nice. Yeah, I like that.
And a special shout out to Alex. Thanks for the email and for the artwork. I want to figure out something to get that up on the website somehow. And I also want to say, don't game in me, bro. Don't game in me. Okay. All right. So today's topic is one actually Kristin's quite fond of the way the gods work in my world. So we want to take some time today to talk about the gods of Gardul. And it's a system I don't know how I developed it, to be honest. It just sort of came to me over time. But it's a system. And so essentially, there's a race of beings in my universe that are called gods. There are, I believe, 12 of them.
Wow.
And they account for every god on my world because they're never known by their real names. Each culture have their own gods, their own beliefs. But the gods of my universe literally try to insert themselves into each of those areas. And essentially the idea is they sustain themselves. Their power is based off of faith.
Right. Well, it's kind of, if you're a fan of history, you kind of think of how the Romans co-opted the Greek gods.
Kind of. Yeah.
That they were kind of like, these gods are cool. Okay, let's take these. We're going to rename them, kind of shuffle around a little bit like what they stand for. But okay, we're going to take these ones. And you kind of,
there's a merger of the Jupiter and Zeus sort of become one, and
right. And I think if you look at cultures that interacted in ancient times, you see a lot of that. It was in South America. There was the fanged,
the fanged god,
the fanged deity, right? And you see that like all over South America with different names, with different, slightly different looks, but it's all this fanged god that had like snakes, coming out of their belt and stuff like that.
And certain cultures, early on, they're more separate from each other and their gods sort of develop. Like the Etruscans is another interesting one because their gods were kind of boring. It's like the chief god and goddess actually loved each other and sort of got along. And so when they started interacting with the Greeks, they started adopting a lot of the Greek stories and mythologies, but mixing their gods into them. And when cultures collide, religions have a tendency to do that, where they'll start learning of new things and each can incorporate it in their own way. And I'm sure somewhere along the way, the logic in my mind formed for this idea of faith being the core thing, and it's really the gods battling for each other. Like one of the things I accused Neil Gaiman of stealing my brain and publishing it like years before I could was American Gods, and I was running a story very similar along those lines. It's different in my world because it's all the same gods, and they're just battling and repositioning throughout the civilization. So if money becomes a god, it would still be one of these 12 beings, what I call the gods of Gardul. And that would be gods with a little g, because they're not omnipotent, they're not all powerful. They will appear that way probably to humans and to other races because their power so far surpasses them. But they're ethereal. They're not part of this realm. Maybe it's in another dimension. Maybe it's an outer plane. However you want to determine isn't really important. The fact is they don't exist on the same level of existence as actual normal races do. And
okay.
They eat faith. Faith gives them the energy to move forward. And a lot of the conflict between the gods comes from that. And that a lot is actually brought in from especially Greek. The Greek gods were particularly spiteful, mean critters. This idea that I come up in my world where you don't necessarily want to be noticed by the gods because that usually means that you're going to have a bad day. You might be a great hero, whatever. That's great. You know, you might be Achilles and you can die young. Yay. But be never forgotten, or, you know, die old as a farmer and no one ever really remembers you. That's what happens when gods notice you. Great things typically happen, but it's usually not a happy ending. Yeah.
And I think that happened to one of my characters in one of the games that you ran, that my character got noticed by the gods, and it was not a good thing. It was a really bad thing.
No, that was worse than a god. There are things worse than gods in my world, and that was one of them. Okay. So quickly to go over the actual, I guess you call this the Pantheon. There are the three biggies. There are the three originators. We're going to start with number 2 on the list because it's the most important, is Mystr. And Mystr is the goddess of life in my universe. And she's been busy. I mean, it's like she gave birth to the cosmos. That's how it all began.
Well, she's the goddess of life, so I mean that's that
but she
makes
gave
you a
birth
busy
to the entire cosmos. That's a bad labor.
So you notice it's like the female gods, like they do all this stuff, and then the male gods just show up and they
become like the chief god,
right?
Mm-hmm.
And like, hey, we're ordering chaos. She's like, but wait a minute, I gave birth to all of this, and they're like, that's right. Whatever.
But essentially the idea was it was a big blurry mess. It was just this cosmos kind of spewed all out everywhere. It was no good. Until the next 2 gods, Festus and Boriek, came along. Boriek is now also one of the cats of the household, who you'll probably never hear on the podcast, unlike some of the other ones.
And chaos is a really good definition for him. That's why we named him Boriek.
Well, actually, it ended up that he lived up to the name of Boriek. We didn't know when we first got him. But we name all of our cats after mythological deities. And this was the first one that we actually named after one from my world. And we're like, maybe it's time to get off the Stargate and get onto my own stuff.
Well, since you spent so much time and you've developed this out so well, maybe we should name the cat after your gods.
But Festus, beyond being the god of order, is sort of the god of construction, too. And I have Forge written down for him, but it's not quite true, but it's forming things. And so one of the major things he does is he chisels out a very orderly world. But of course, if you look at the world and the universe, it's not a very orderly place. It's order in some spots and not order in others. And that's sort of this symbolicness between Festus and Boriek. Their battles lead to the chaos and the development of order in the universe. And as much as gods, they hate each other. Essentially, it is the interaction of the two that keep the universe going forward. Now, from those first 3 gods, there were 9 others that sort of came about. And during the battle between Festus and Boriek, you have Boriek gets knocked down forever, and when he lands, which is ironic, only gods can do that. Mm-hmm. Gods can fall forever and land. None of the rest of us can do that.
All right, so I have a question. So and I'm assuming that this is going to go in the show notes. So Festus is Fe, and he's also the god of the forge. Did you do that intentionally?
No.
Okay, because that worked out pretty well. Because Fe is the abbreviation for iron.
Weird. I'm not that clever.
I think you probably were, and you didn't realize it. But I thought that was kind of interesting. And actually, it was funny because I actually like Googled it to make sure I was right before I said it. But I'm like, I'm pretty sure the Fe is iron on the periodic table. Oh, wait, it is. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I just thought that was kind of amusing since he's the god of the forge. Yeah, I'm pretty sure you did that intentionally.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Okay.
But it's cool, though. And for geeks like me, I'm like, that is so cool.
Yeah, essentially, if you go check out the show notes of this episode, there'll be a listing of the gods. Later on, we're going to talk about how it works in a real life scenario, talking about the Baurhdrakkeim paganism, which has also been another episode on. But I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here and the connection to these actual god beings. And because, like I said, they don't go by their own names, but they're battling each other for supremacy.
All right. Well, then I've got a question then, because you said they're not known by their own names, but there are the Mysteritos elves.
Weird, huh?
So isn't Mystr known by her own name because of the Mysteritos?
That's what the Mysteritos would say.
Okay.
And seeing the god's name is Mystr, that would seem like quite a coincidence.
Okay. So could they be known by their main names?
They could be, but it would just be coincidentally, maybe.
Okay.
It's from the culture. So, I mean, they're all culturally appropriate names.
Is this like PC Game World over here?
Not
okay.
PC Game World. It happens to work out that, they happen to have a chief goddess and her name is Mystr. And you don't screw with Mystr and the Mystr. You don't do it.
It'll be messy.
It won't be pretty. You won't have a good day. A lot of weird South Park references making it into this episode so far.
Well, and I mean, from observing your game table and...
In general, you don't want to screw with actual god beings in my world.
Yeah, no, because, I mean, you had one game where you, blew up the entire cosmos.
Yeah, it was Neil Gaiman's fault.
Actually, it was.
It was, yes.
Because one of the players at the table was like, this is based on American gods. And you didn't even, you had no idea. And I had actually read the book. Mm-hmm. And, yeah.
Oh, I destroyed the whole universe.
Yeah. I
am a bitter GM. Curse you, Neil Gaiman. Okay. But so going back to the Pantheon, during the battle, Boriek falls down forever and lands because he's a god. And from his splatter comes Misac, I guess is how, I have no idea how to pronounce my names, the god of emotion. So for me, in my universal view for this world, emotion and chaos are connected.
So does that mean that Boriek no longer exists?
No, Boriek...
Well, you said from his splat, and splat makes me think that he went splat and doesn't exist anymore.
It's not that simple, but no. He's
so like a
there.
Piece of him splatted away. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right.
There's only one god that gets killed in this story. Well, in the creation mythos, which this is how the gods came about. This is the gods' view of how the gods came about. And then all of a sudden you have Festus and Mystr get married and have a couple babies. One is called Tempo, and the other called Febos, and that is the god of time and the god of emotions.
No, the god of time and elements.
Elements are very emotional to me. Fire makes me cry.
Like iron. Iron is very emotional.
Okay. And then...
and they're twins.
Yes.
Right? Okay.
And that's a big key for everyone. You must have twins and pantheons. It's weird, but they're everywhere. And not necessarily they don't have to be in the pantheon, but in every culture there always seems to be a twins, whether it's brothers who form Rome or there's usually god twins. But there are always twins for some reason. And once again, that's usually not a good thing. Ask Abel.
So maybe maybe to be different, you put triplets in.
Well, that's if you're trying to be different, but that goes back to the episode on being original.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can do triplets, but it's really not original. Okay. And then there's another Mira, which is the goddess of nature, another child of Mystr. Once again, very busy woman.
Mm-hmm. Poor thing. And she gets none of the credit.
Actually, she's one of the more powerful gods in the Pantheon we'll get to later.
Well, I mean, you would figure nature is, even if you think about our own culture, people that follow kind of a goddess of nature, that's a major theme. Yeah, exactly.
Then there is also, she's the goddess of nature. Then Thrax, one of my favorites. And if you listen to the episode where I talked about, I think, dragon mythology with Michael, you'll notice that Thrax, Festus, Mystr, and Boriek were all in that one. So if you want to grade it by relevance, well, this is another one of those circumstances where it doesn't happen, but it did.
Well, and you figure, because Thrax is the god of revenge, right? And revenge is such a powerful emotion that people feel that it does make sense that
it's on its own.
That would be a powerful god.
It's sort of like a peeled off, and actually that was Misac, the god of motion, was killed by Festus. Killed.
So how does the god of emotion die?
Don't worry, he comes back.
Okay, because I was going to say, then we'd all kind of be like drones walking around.
But see, once again, that's another important thing. Gods can come back. No one else can. But when he's killed, the god of law and the god of revenge are both created at the same time.
So how does he come back?
Well, that's later on. That's guess who? Mystr.
Of course.
So Mystr brings him back, and then they have a baby, and which is the god of death. Actually, I'm sorry, that is Mira. Mira brings him back, and then they have a baby called with Festus called the god of death.
Because it's very important in your gods that there's got to be some incest or whatever that needs.
Well, think
to
about
happen.
There are 3 gods at the beginning,
right?
So there has to be cheating. There has to be incest because it's sort of like ancient nobility. It's like you're always marrying your cousin, which, as you see over time, doesn't really work out. And then all of a sudden, Mystr and Mystic have 2 children when she brings back Mystic, Luna and Llivian. I have no idea if those are pronounced correctly. The goddess of love and the god of magic.
Okay, so you don't have magic until
maybe not.
Okay,
this is all pre-races. This is really early in history.
Oh, okay, all right. So this is Big Bang poof.
And then Mystr pumps out every creature in the universe, gives birth to all of them. Including the 3 original races, which are dragons, giants, and oh my goodness, my brain is freezing up.
Elves?
No.
Oh no, these are the big ones.
The Prima.
Okay.
Wow, I missed Prima.
Wow. You need more coffee.
Prima are destroyed by the god of revenge, and that creates what I call the Neo races, which are all the races that are in the world in the time of stories: humans, elves, dwarfs, halflings, they're all there.
Okay.
And they all come from the Prima being shattered. And all of their good elements are what made it the Prima because they were so cool.
So there's a lot of splattering and shattering in your initial formation.
Yes. Yeah, no, if you read or if you listen to that episode on the dragon mythology that Michael and I talked about, that gives you a quick sum up. I don't know if it was a whole episode we just talked about in an episode. I'll see if I can find it. I'll link it in the show notes. But that's kind of the beginning. It doesn't cover all of the gods. It just covers the big 3 and how you get to the races, and why dragons are so afraid of gods. Because they, in their mythology, interacted with them. Whether or not it's true, they got the names right. Okay. So
I have a question. So how did you focus on these items? I understand life and order and chaos coming from the beginning, and then you've got emotion and then time and the elements. How did you decide kind of when you were putting this together which components went first? Because I thought it was interesting that you did emotion, emotion came before
and then
time,
from emotional
and
output comes different really strong emotions like revenge, the sense of law. That's if there's a parental god, it's probably him. Yes, love comes from him.
But I think it's interesting because I think most, if you think of, like the Christian religion, or even Judaism, when you think of Genesis, right? Genesis starts with time. In the beginning, this happened, right? Which is kind of the beginning of time. But time doesn't come for you
until much later. Yeah. Because for me, maybe there was something like time before that. Who knows? But for the universe, it didn't exist until the point that time was born.
Okay.
So,
and you figure you kind of think like Boriek went splat. Everybody went, oh, that's so sad. And then emotion, poof. Poof. And there was fighting and stuff, which,
yep.
Emotion. That makes sense.
Yeah. No. And the important one is the gods of magic in my world, especially with my new fascination of the electric universe. Magic is plasma, and controlling electricity, controlling plasma is not being a magician. So if you have an engineer who's good at setting up wires, you're controlling electricity, but you're not using it correctly because electricity is the thing that binds the universe together. So when you have life and emotion coming together, that's actually that is the connection of the universe in my universe.
And that was like the coolest video. It really was. And it made a lot of sense to me as somebody who's studied science.
Yes.
You should put the link.
I'll put the link to that in this episode as well too.
But basically the idea, and Jeff kind of mentioned a little bit.
We did just do like a huge episode.
Oh, all right, cool.
Yeah, me and Michael did that one. So,
well, this is what I get for popping in and out, when Michael can't make it to record.
Well, that's why I didn't need you to go over it all again, but I'll link to that episode in the show notes.
Okay. I missed the cool stuff like electrical universes.
I think it's a very cool concept, but to understand the way I think in my universe, though, you have to understand it is life and emotion is the things that tie the whole galaxy together. And to be a magician, you're tapping in through those things to pull out effects. So you could pull out an elemental effect by going through emotion, by going through life. That's how magic works in my world.
Okay. I'm still bummed I missed the Electric Universe episode.
Well, you can always listen. Rate and review it on iTunes would be wonderful too.
I guess I'll have to do that.
Okay. But let's see. So we talked a bit about the actual Pantheon, and we talked a little bit about the actual god beings. But now I want to take the Baurhdrakkeim culture, which will be...
Before you do that, so you have in the notes here that the goal is faith. What does that mean?
Oh, yeah. I should probably cover that. So
you're jumping all over the place.
Well, I talked about that a bit earlier, but I'm going to reiterate it. The idea is the sustenance of these god beings is not food. It's not energy per se. Another South Park reference for you fans out there. It is actually faith. That's what gives them the energy they need to survive. It's what, if they have excess of it, they become stronger. And that's the key. That's the games that they're playing with each other.
So can they actually fade away if people stop believing in them?
I don't think so, but they become much weaker and out of it, and they'll be looking for ways to get back in. Maybe.
Okay.
I'm not saying. It's unimportant because the same battles are always fought for what people have faith in over time. And it might not be a pantheon of gods like in earlier cultures, but the same battles go on. You have faith that your football team is going to win this week, that your political party is going to save your country. That's faith that you have. And you might think that there's logic involved in it, and there might be, but ultimately it's faith that it will work this time. It will work the next time.
Well, and I think as as we go into kind of the next section and you start talking about how the gods have kind of positioned themselves and that they're actually the same god is multiple gods to a culture. So like, okay, if we stop believing in this piece, but we still believe in that piece, they're still believing in the same god and they're still getting their power fed.
Yeah. And when we talk about the Baurhdrakkeim gods, one of the things to keep in mind too is whenever I talk about polytheism and I give a list of gods, it will never be all of them because typically it's very common to have sort of household gods or
the god of biscuits. That's important.
Or the god of biscuits, who's not listed strangely, but
well, because it's Jeff, the god of biscuits. So you know.
But the thing to keep in mind is there's usually more gods in any polytheistic culture. They're very regional, localized ones. They're bigger ones. I usually talk about the major gods when I'm talking about religion in my world. One of the ideas too is the Baurhdrakkeim culture's religion is not as regionally based, or it's not state based. So some cultures like in Hellenistic Greece and Rome, they had state based religions where essentially paying homage to the gods were good for the state. In older religions like Sumeria, your king is God, and in Egypt the same thing. Your king is God, and you better treat him that way or you're in trouble. Later on, like in Rome, you might worship the emperor, but that's more like saying a pledge of allegiance than really what we think of as a prayer in modern society.
But you figure, in Rome, at least at some points in history, when the emperor died, like they voted to make them a god.
Yes, like not all of them, but like certain ones, and maybe after a while, all of them, I don't know. But like Augustus became an actual Pantheon member after his death. You prayed to him when he was alive, but it meant something different. But part of that is their culture is very based off of dead people are actually more important than living. And so if you go in the house, they worship their ancestors as well too. That's why I'm saying the list of pantheons are never complete because they can't be, because there's so many variations in local areas, in families, depending on the culture. There's so many different variations that kind of the ones you hear about are the big ones. Even when you learn about like mythology for the Greeks, there are a lot more Greek gods than ones that you read about when you get books on mythology.
Well, and I think that's why it's important to kind of understand within each culture to not necessarily name all their gods, but to understand how their gods are created. And
how they're viewed. Like the Greeks viewed their gods as a very human-like being that was really tall, that lived, in this mountain that overlooked Earth. The Etruscans and Romans, their gods, especially before the cohesion with the Greeks, were very ethereal. They didn't really have human forms. They would make icons of them that were human, but that wasn't the way they viewed them. And so those are the sort of the tweaks that you need to understand when you're building a pantheon is how's the real interaction between the culture? And then as cultures collide, how do they change?
So I would imagine that in your world, people would have like icons of their gods and statues of their gods, right? Because that would show that
It depends on the culture.
Okay.
All have symbols. Like Baurhdrakkeim culture does not have icons for their gods. The gods are super ethereal. They use the way they signify their gods are in letters. So the letters of the Baurhdrakkeim alphabet actually are shortcuts for gods' names. And so there are three different, what I call, I don't know what the best way to call it is, like courts. And when you think of a court, think of like a king's court, right? There are three different courts in the Baurhdrakkeim culture. The first is, and I'm going to translate this to English because I don't have the pronunciation down next to the
Yeah, I have no idea how to pronounce these.
Is there are three courts, and think of them as good, neutral, and evil. But one would be, the literal translation would be good and holy. And that is the main pantheon of gods. So think about this is your, and when I say good and holy, that means that's the one that's important to the culture, the most connected to the culture. It doesn't necessarily mean their actions are good and holy as you would think about it as a modern day, especially Western Christian. It would not fall under those same realms. But you have the good and holy court. And then you have the holy court, which would be sort of the neutral gods. They sort of swing towards good or evil depending on which side's doing better. In a way, they keep balance in the universe. And then you have the evil gods, or the bad and holy. And they're very literal people, the Baurhdrakkeim. But you have these three different courts, and there's a series of important gods with each of these. And each of them, they have different names, but it's actually parts played by these god creatures that we talked about before. So Festus, for example, is the god Drakk. And if you look at the name Baurhdrakkeim, you'll notice Drakk is actually in there. It means followers of Drakk, because there was a schism early on in the culture, in the proto-culture, which kind of created two groups. One that had the chief god of Khunzud, and the other one had the chief god of Drakk. And when they split off, they took two different directions as cultures. So one was much more warlike. They liked magic and learning. And that was sort of their focus, at least when they split off.
And this is under the good and holy category.
This is under the good and holy. Drakk is also, he became the chief god for this pantheon for one group as well too. And he's a god of protection, of poetry, of hearth. Hearth is another one that people don't think about much today. But in most early cultures, Hearth was one of the most important gods. And there's actually, I think, a couple gods of the Hearth. Well, hospitality, which is kind of the same thing, culturally speaking. But that's because that's where the fire was. And if the fire went out early on in a culture, you die.
Right.
Or you don't have a good day.
Well, and think about it. It's like Hearth was warmth in the home, cooking in the home, so that was really, if you think about food and warmth, right? Those are like the two big things that you need in order to stay alive.
Yeah.
So any of your gods of the hearth, I mean, that's essentially life, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And
so
then,
why isn't that Mystr?
Why is that not Mystr? Which one's God of Life here? I'm not seeing God of Life.
Yeah, no, I'm not either.
No, they don't have a god of life. They have a god of nature, which is Mystr. She's the Mystr is the goddess of love, hospitality, and home.
Oh, okay.
That is what she is. And notice there's a goddess of love in the greater pantheon, but it's not the goddess of love for this culture. And one of the things to keep in mind is the way my gods are vying, they're trying to work into the cultural understanding of things. So the cultural understanding of love here is not necessarily the same as somewhere else. It is not necessarily the same as the universal love. But the gods want faith so badly, they will actually betray the own thing that they're a god of to get faith, because faith is what feeds them. They're most identified with love or law or revenge, but they will interact with cultures because they're trying to get that faith. And it sort of creates the idea too in polytheistic religions where you can play gods off of each other. And it's very true in my universe because they're so desperate for the faith, they'll want to help you if possible. But the problem is if you get noticed and helped, then maybe you offend a different god. There's always a price to pay in that scenario. But there are several gods, but that was, and one of the important things to understand too is Khunzud and Drakk are Festus and Boriek. And so their hostility in their characters in my universe plays through in the religion. And actually it was really a part where Drakk usurped Boriek's people essentially to create the Baurhdrakkeim. And later on there's a reconnection of these, but it's very far down the line and they don't even realize they come from the same culture anymore. It's been so long. But sometimes learning's the hard way. Now, Festus, beyond being Drakk, is also Frommin, the god of the Sun and the Forge, which you would not be shocked with either there. He is also, he did not make it. Oh my goodness. He got shut out of the Holy Court. And it looks like he got shut out of the Baden Holy Court. But the thing,
no, he's in the Baden Holy Court.
Where's FV? Oh yes, he is Vis Minimum.
So it's kind of interesting because you figure like the neutral court, though, that kind of makes sense because there's no order in it based off how you described it, right? You described they'll kind of swing.
But remember,
with whoever is
if he could put himself in there, he would.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's just where his character is tied to order and creating things. So he will try and con his way in there. And maybe there's some minor gods that are involved in that court that he's a part of, but he's not risen up to the major level in that court.
Now, is this like a pyramid scheme? So like if, people believe in your children, does it like help feed you? Okay, no, it's got to be directly you.
Directly you.
Okay.
If they like your children, you don't like your children because you're a god, and gods hate their children. They hate their spouse. It sucks being a god.
So if it sucks being a god and it sucks being noticed by a god, just basically it sucks.
Yeah.
Is what you're saying. Okay.
Especially when you get to early cultures, it sucks. Life sucks. Most of your time is based on sustenance. Your extra stuff gets probably taken by the state to help grow parts of the economy they think are important. And it leaves most of the people living, harvest to harvest instead of paycheck to paycheck, I guess.
Yeah. Since the beginning of time.
Since the beginning of time. But so essentially, and there'll be some more complete notes on the actual breakdown. I don't want to go through necessarily all of the gods and who they belong to, but some of the important distinctions are all of these gods are at least one major god within this pantheon. But it doesn't matter how many gods you are, even how many major gods you are. Festus benefits a lot from being the chief god, because that means ultimately people are paying him respect no matter what. So you might have 5 other gods, major gods, and not drive as much faith, as much sustenance out of being a god of the Baurhdrakkeim as other things. And he might not be the chief god in every pantheon. And actually, he might not be the god of order in every pantheon, So a lot of it is, once again, culturally based. So let's think of revenge for a second. Some legalistic systems are based off of revenge, not off of justice. When I say the god of law, it's not the word justice, it's law. It is the way things are supposed to be. So when he ends up being the god of law, that's sort of a sign that the culture is sort of lined up with sort of universal laws. And one of the big ones he hates is adultery, but it's because he was born out of he was born out of a killing because of adultery. So I mean, it kind of works out. But there's always this struggle, and this is sort of the Baurhdrakkeim pantheon at the time of the first book I'll be releasing next June. But over time, this changes. There's actually a sort of a changing of the guard happening, religiously speaking, where this is very much the Stone Age version of their paganism. And over time, it adapts and changes. And in the period of the books, that's starting to adapt and change too.
Okay, so I've got a question as I'm looking through this list. Okay. And you're going to want to check out the show notes for this episode, because the full list will be there. But so I notice under the evil and holy, right, there's, let's see, Askai? Is that how you say that? Which is the god of heat, sand, and death. So is that an arid culture? Is it like a desert culture?
Could be.
Well, I'm just, I'm drawing connections.
Yes, and you're probably drawing a correct connection there.
But I think that's, And
if you notice too, like when you look at the evil court, it's like you have the god of heat, sand, and death. And notice heat and sand are connected to death. With the Baurhdrakkeim live, there's no real sand. There's a little bit on the shores, but it's not like there's no deserts really. There's some drier spots, but there are no deserts. But where they came from, there was a conflict with a group, and it sort of became this cultural belief of theirs that heat and sand, which they were much closer to the equator, and there were some deserts involved in the area, that led them to believe that that made sand, that made heat connected to evil in the culture. And so, yes, there's very much the connection that you're making up in your mind right there. There's a group called the Askai, which will be of growing relevance in my novel series. And they very much come from a hot place, and there's a bunch of sand in the area.
Okay. Now, why is the leader of the dwarfs an evil god?
Because he is anti-cultural. So the dwarfs in the area were a rival kingdom, and then they got absconded by the orcs, or the cursed people. And so, especially now that they are the cursed people, which are the orcs, and the dwarfs were subjugated by them, the remaining dwarfs in the area are essentially subjugated by the cursed people, making their god by default evil.
Okay.
And it's ironically the goddess of love. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of, that's weird.
But you'll find these, what you consider inconsistencies, but it's showing the way that gods are struggling to become relevant. And she did it by adapting that part of their culture, which is their view of the dwarfs, which is not positive, as you can tell.
Right. But no, I think that that's a really good point, is that so if somebody's trying to develop like their pantheon, would you suggest doing that first, at least your top gods? And then as you're developing your culture, you say, okay, how do these gods fit into these cultures? Or do you develop cultures first?
It's a bit of both. So essentially, like if I have an idea, there's usually a few basic things I have in my brain. I usually say I have 3 points of description for a culture before I start doing it. Those are going to probably be the most important gods. And for the Baurhdrakkeim, it is Drakk, it is Darriq, and it is Khansad are probably the 3 most important gods for them. And in those 3 gods are for the whole basic idea of the Baurhdrakkeim is they're very what they consider defensively stanced, where they're worried about walls, they're worried about shields, they're worried about those kind of things, they're worried about protecting hearth and home, and that's very much in the 3 major gods of the culture. That's where they come from. And there might not always be 3 major gods of the culture. One god might take all of those attributes on, or might have little of them taken on, but the cultural beliefs create the pantheon. So you need the cultural beliefs to create the pantheon, but you probably start your cultural beliefs from where you're coming from with the culture. And so as you build it out, as you develop, your pantheon grows, where there were very few gods in this pantheon early on. They were fleshed out over time. And
I do like the way that there are contradictions.
Yeah.
I think that's cool, because I think it goes with the narrative that they're battling for faith.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes love is ugly.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people do really bad things in the name of love. So that's the thing to understand, is don't take your personal preferences and apply them. Understand that they change. And the irony would be, if you take this culture back 1,000 years, the dwarven leader he'd be a holy, not a bad and holy god.
Because it has to evolve over time.
Because initially when they came in the area, there was a dwarven kingdom of its own. But over time, after the orcs came through and all of the dwarfs were subjugated, God became evil.
Gotcha.
And the god of love was more than willing to play that role for the faith.
Right, exactly.
Now, you don't necessarily need this idea of faith feeding gods in your world. You can or cannot do that. I doubt that's anywhere close to being an original idea. But the idea is, I think the important thing is, especially once you start getting into it, is the reason I like doing it is I'm very process driven. And so this idea where I have these gods, but the importance of culture in my world is very big. So from culture to culture, the pantheons will not look the same. Like if you go to the Siren, which will be another culture that are mentioned early on, and I don't know if they really play a big role. I don't think they play a big role in my initial books that are coming out. Outside of this thing that you hear about, they have effects in this pantheon as well, because they typically, they're a lunar-driven society. They typically raid when the moon, and notice the moon is a bad thing, because this is a culture that they're fighting against. But vice versa, in their culture, the moon's a very good thing. So the cultures end up driving the way that people look at things. And to understand the way that people think in general will allow you to more quickly adapt and create that framework you need to be able to continuously tell stories from the same world.
All right. And I think it's important to, I like the fact that you have your 12, right?
Mm-hmm.
And your 12 fill out everything else.
Yeah.
So it's not, you know, I mean, if you think about, you know, the history of religion on this planet,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, we've had so many gods,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I like this idea of just having 12,
Mm-hmm.
but the 12 fit the cultural needs, you know, of a group.
Yes. And they will do whatever they can to be in there. And in a way, it's probably a symbiotic kind of relationship because, you know, the gods are going to spur favor on the people who support them as much as they can. But since they're in a separate plane, it's very ethereal, the kinds of help they get. And over time, the importance of ones will come and wane. Like the Gods of the Moon, for example, wasn't big until they even got into this part of the world. It was a non-entity. It wasn't important at all. The whole lunar cycle was not important to the Baurhdrakkeim until they got in this area and they had this great conflict with this lunarly based culture. It was there and they spoke about it in their mythology, but the Gods of the Moon would have been much more minor.
Okay, so I got another question. So, all right, under your good and holy, you have a god called Kanja. And she is the goddess of winter, fertility, and death.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that pairing come about for them?
Okay. Especially in the more northern parts of this area, it's colder. Winter is death.
Okay, so how's fertility work into that? Because fertility is death?
When do you make babies?
In the winter?
When you're stuck inside.
Okay, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Well, no, but I was thinking too, like, you know, especially in early cultures, pregnancy was a huge risk, right?
Which also plays into that fertility and death are tied hand to hand. And where in some ways in a magically based world, you can kind of help mitigate some of those if you're richer. If you're poor, you don't get to escape that.
Right. So no, that totally makes sense. So I like, and I can also see too that, you know, you're kind of talking about like alliances and, you know, so I could kind of see some of these gods like teaming up. Like, for example, you've got Frommin and Germ-ig that will kind of be teaming up because one is sun and forge and the other one's summer, rain and wind, and kind of saying, okay, so we're going to pair up, right? And we're going to target the farmers.
Yeah.
Okay. And if we can get them to worship both of us, right?
Yep.
So, you know, you can kind of see that too, where they're teaming up with each other.
And where even, and once again, it goes back to this idea that there are actual like 12 characters behind all of my gods. So the greatest enmity they have for Festus will always be Boriek. Irregardless of what he thinks, if he thinks he can weaken Boriek by going with another god he doesn't like so well most of the time, he'll do it. So that is really it for this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know a little bit about what you think about pantheons and how you think about gods in your world. And, you know, I'm very culturally crazy and other people aren't. So how do you come up with your gods? How do you come up with your pantheons? Make sure to hit me up on Twitter or email me and let's have a discussion.
Thank you so much for listening to the World Builders Anvil. We would love it if you would share the World Builders Anvil with 2 of your friends, and so would they. If they are unfamiliar with podcasts, then you get to introduce them to the wonderful world of podcasting by showing them Stitcher or iTunes, or, best of all, just send them to our website, www.gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com.
Now strike while the mithril's hot.